about the molecules that make up all living things. And these are called macromolecules because macro means big, and these are big, big molecules. The macromolecules are all organic compounds. That is, they are made by living things and broken down by living things. And they are polymers. Well, 3 of the 4 kinds are polymers. And a polymer is a molecule that is made of a smaller repeating unit over and over again. So the way you can think of a polymer is think of a freight train. If a freight train is the whole big molecule as the polymer, then the individual cars that make up the train would be the repeating units that we call monomers. So mono means one and poly means many. A monomer is a single unit of a polymer. There are 4 kinds of macromolecules that we're going to study this year in biology class, and they are the carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Of these macromolecules, all of them are polymers except the lipids. The lipids have many different kinds of shapes, and they are not all made of repeating units, although there are some things about them that are similar, so we will learn a little bit about their structure. The nucleic acids include things like DNA and RNA. That's what the NA in DNA stands for. And they are so important and so interesting that they get their own unit all to themselves. So we will be studying those in January. So what we're going to just focus on for the first couple weeks of this macromolecules unit right now is the carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Before we move on, I just want to give you a general information about what these molecules are for. And the carbohydrates, as you've probably heard before, are for energy, and you know this in the context of food. You eat carbohydrates in order to get energy for your body. And the proteins are for building up muscle is probably what you've learned, and in general proteins are for building up the structure of any living thing because all organisms are made out of proteins. In addition, proteins make up the enzymes, and enzymes are important for catalyzing all chemical reactions. The lipids are the fats and oils and other molecules that are what we call hydrophobic. That means they don't dissolve in water or they don't like water. And lipids include molecules that are important for insulation, for protection, and they make up the cell membrane. And also they include things like waxes, which protect the surfaces of leaves or the insides of your ears. And also, as you know from, again, nutrition and diet information, fats and oils are important for energy storage. So they're important energy sources in your body, and you burn them up for fuel. So that's just a general introduction to those that we're going to be studying. The nucleic acids are the molecules that give the instructions to all of your cells about which kinds of proteins to build. And so again, we'll be learning about the nucleic acids in detail later. Now, before we go on, I just want to remind you that all living organisms are made of these 4 kinds of biological compounds. So whether we're talking about bacteria or fungi or plants or animals, all living organisms are made of these same kinds of molecules, and the structures of these molecules are remarkably similar in all these different organisms. So even though it's going to tax our brains a little bit to learn all this new information about the structure and function of these molecules, when we're learning it, we're not just learning about our own biology and human biology, but we're learning about all living things on Earth, and fortunately, it's the same for all of us. So we're going to start with carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are the, as we said, energy-providing molecules, and all of them contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The hydrogen to oxygen ratio in carbohydrates is always 2 to 1, and that's similar to another little molecule you're familiar with, namely water. Carbohydrates are made up of monomers of monosaccharides, so that is the repeating unit over and over that makes up a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. And 3 examples of monosaccharides that are most important in biology are glucose, fructose, and galactose. The arrow is pointing toward a glucose molecule. All monosaccharides have the formula C6H12O6. So if we have that same formula and yet we have 3 different names, glucose, fructose, and galactose, you're probably wondering what's different about those molecules. Well, what's different about them is their shape or structure. So even though they all have the same formula, they're put together slightly differently, and this is why we have different names for them, and they have different functions in living organisms. We can number the carbons starting from the right of the oxygen. If you notice in this ring of glucose, we have, let's see if I can get the pen. We have an oxygen here in the ring, right here. So this is carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 up here. And all carbohydrates contain a very important functional group called a hydroxyl group, right here, a hydroxyl group. That's the OH group. Don't confuse that with the hydroxide ions, which we learned about when we learned about acids and bases. Hydroxide ions are present in many bases because bases are ionic compounds that dissociate in water into a negatively charged OH ion and some other positive ion. But the hydroxyl group on carbohydrates does not dissociate. It always stays securely attached to the molecule. But what it does do is it does impart the property of solubility in water, because the hydroxyl group is a polar functional group. So the oxygen, as you know, is hugging the electrons away from the hydrogen. There's a slight negative charge on the oxygen. There's a slight positive charge on the hydrogen. Right here, slight negative. Right here, slight positive. And this is true of all of these hydroxyl groups. So they make the molecule nicely soluble in water, which is important because glucose is the primary energy source for all of the cells of all living things, and therefore it needs to be transported to the cells. And the way that your body transports energy to all of your cells is through the blood. So the molecule glucose needs to dissolve nicely in blood, as well as in cytoplasm and the other transportation liquids of other organisms. Now we will look at isomers. This is a new word you need to know. We've mentioned it a little bit before, but an isomer is a molecule that has the same structure as another, the same formula as another, but a different structure. So glucose and fructose, which are both monosaccharides, both have the formula C6H12O6, but fructose is much sweeter. And if you look at it, it has a slightly different structure here. This is fructose. It is a ring structure, but there are only 5 carbons in the ring, so it's a 5-membered ring here. I mean 4 carbons in the ring, and 2 carbons are outside of the ring, this one and this one. But it's a 5-membered ring because it has oxygen in the ring also. Whereas glucose is a 6-membered ring, having oxygen in the ring but only 1 carbon that's outside the ring. So the main thing to know about isomers is biological compounds have to have a specific shape in order to carry out their function. And so the shape of fructose gives it very different properties from glucose, which has a different shape. Fructose, for example, fits into the taste receptors in your taste buds in a way that causes the neurons to fire more rapidly to the brain, sending the message that this molecule that you're tasting right now is very sweet. Whereas glucose does not fit into the taste receptors as well and doesn't send this message quite as intensely as fructose does, and that's purely due to the difference in shape. So fructose tastes much sweeter than glucose. Isomers therefore have different chemical and physical properties even though they have the same formula. A disaccharide is two monosaccharides put together. Saccharide as a suffix means sugar, and di means two. So a disaccharide is a 2 sugar, and a monosaccharide is a 1 sugar, and a polysaccharide is a many sugar. Sucrose, lactose, and maltose are the most important disaccharides in living organisms. Sucrose is what you know of as table sugar. Lactose is the kind of sugar found in milk. And maltose is a kind of sugar produced by some plants. And it's also known as malt sugar and is what gives things like malted milkshakes, malted milk balls, their distinctive flavor. All of these disaccharides are made up of glucose plus one other monosaccharide. Sucrose is made up of glucose and fructose. Lactose is made up of glucose and galactose. And maltose is made up of glucose and glucose. And again, these sugars, they're called, are very important energy molecules for the cell. They are transported easily throughout the blood because they're still very small, and they are delivered to the cells where the cells can break them apart into monosaccharides and burn them up for energy. If you put many monosaccharide units together, then you have a polysaccharide. Polysaccharides are known as complex carbohydrates, whereas the mono and disaccharides are simple carbohydrates. The polysaccharides include starch, glycogen, and cellulose, and we'll learn what those are for coming up here soon. Now you may be wondering about high fructose corn syrup because you've probably heard of this before, and maybe in the context of your diet and whether you should consume it. High fructose corn syrup is a sweetener that is made from cornstarch. If cornstarch is a polysaccharide, which is just a chain of glucose units strung together, food scientists figured out, especially around World War II time when luxury items included sugar and it was expensive and hard to get because it was imported from South America and Cuba, they figured out that, we have lots of cornstarch because we can grow corn easily in the United States. If we put some enzymes in with the cornstarch that will break the units off right here at the individual glucose molecules, then we can break apart the starch and make it into glucose syrup. So now we have a sweetener. But we also realized that glucose is not as sweet as fructose, and it doesn't really mimic sugar exactly in its chemistry because sucrose, or sugar, is made up of one glucose unit and one fructose unit. So they realized that if we add another type of enzyme, which we can get from bacteria called glucose isomerase, this enzyme will turn glucose into its isomer, fructose. And so they stir around the glucose syrup for a while with this second enzyme and allow it to convert some of the glucose to fructose. If we stop when about half of the glucose is converted, then we have a chemical that is virtually identical to sugar syrup. But then they also realized, well, hey, if fructose is sweeter than glucose, let's let the reaction proceed a little bit longer so that there's even more fructose, and now we have a syrup that's even sweeter than sugar syrup, and so this is called high fructose corn syrup. It's really not harmful in the sense that it's different from sugar. The only thing different about it is its slightly higher content of fructose. Fructose is what you're consuming whenever you eat fruit, and that's where the name fructose comes from. So it's not anything artificial in that sense. But the problem with high fructose corn syrup is it is so cheap that it's very abundant, and that is very available for people to purchase and affordable. And so we simply consume too much of it in our diets. Whereas sugar, when we had to import it, was expensive. You were lucky to have a dessert each day or once a week or something like that. And now you can have virtually all the sweets you want, and it's very inexpensive. So we are simply eating too much of this stuff, and it's causing weight problems for many people and all the health problems that go along with that. There's also some more current information that's starting to show that maybe fructose itself is not such a good molecule for us to consume in abundance because it's digested differently and could be causing other health problems as well. Now, we're going to skip this part for now and make it into another video, so check for the other one about hydrolysis and condensation reactions. And we're going to finish up just talking about the functions of carbohydrates here. Carbohydrates, as we already said, are for energy. All cells of living things prefer to burn up glucose as the immediate energy source. But carbohydrates are also good at storing energy, and they store energy in a molecule called starch, if it's a plant, and glycogen, if it's an animal. So you store your energy, your carbohydrate energy, in the form of glycogen. The only difference between these two molecules, they're both polysaccharides, so they're just made up of repeating glucose units, is that starch is more like one big long twisted chain of glucose molecules, kind of like that, whereas glycogen is a branching molecule. And this has to do with the ease with which enzymes can break off glucose units. Enzymes can only break off glucose units from the ends, like here, and here, and here, and here, and here. So on a glycogen molecule, it has many ends to it, like this one and this one. So many enzymes can be working at once to be releasing glucose units from the glycogen and providing more energy, more glucose to all the cells in an animal than enzymes in a plant, which can only cut off glucoses from that end and that end of every starch molecule. But that makes sense as you think about it, because animals need a lot more energy than plants. Animals have to maintain body temperature and move around. So those are the only differences. Otherwise, both of these molecules are made of glucose units repeating over and over again, and the glucose units are for energy. Glycogen is stored in the liver and muscles of animals, so when you eat meat, you're getting some glycogen, and starch is in plants, and you're always getting starch when you eat plants. There is also a structural component to some carbohydrates. Polysaccharides can make up the structure of the exoskeleton of arthropods, like this blue crab here, and that is a molecule called chitin. That's not strictly a polysaccharide because it also contains nitrogen side groups, but it is manufactured from a carbohydrate. And then more importantly really is cellulose. Cellulose is a structural component made only of repeating glucose units, and this polysaccharide makes up the cell wall of all plants. Every single plant on Earth has a wall around each cell, and the wall is made of cellulose, a glucose polymer. But you cannot digest cellulose because you don't have the right enzymes to break it apart. It's joined up slightly differently than starch is. Even though they're both made of the same thing, the bonds that connect cellulose together are differently shaped from the bonds that connect starch together, or glycogen, and so you don't have the right enzymes. No animals do, really. Only some kinds of bacteria have cellulase, the enzyme that can break down cellulose. So when you eat plants that have cellulose in it, which you do whenever you eat any kind of plant food, you are not digesting that molecule. It's not providing energy from you, and in dietary terms it's known as fiber. So it is an important component of our diets. We need to have fiber to help our digestive systems function properly, but it's not an energy source. And it's not an energy source for plants either. It's a structural component of plants. And like all the macromolecules, when foods are broken down, the energy that's contained in the bonds between the carbon and the oxygen, or the carbon and the hydrogen, like there, all of those bonds, when they are broken, release the energy that was stored in those bonds. The energy, of course, that came from the sun originally and was transformed by plants carrying out photosynthesis into chemical energy. And that's everything about carbohydrates.